3, 4. At your door. 5, 6. Don't turn your head. 7, 8. It's getting late. 9, 10. Start again.
Dmitri had been living on his own for 6 months now, and had gotten used to having to handle some household chores on his own, tasks he'd rarely considered before. But yet another problem had him stumped. Dmitri lived completely alone, so he had no need to close the door, but he still did so, even when he was just brushing his teeth. Firstly, out of habit, and secondly, because it gave him a sense of personal space, although one stemmed from the other.
And so, after another shower, when Dmitri had already braced himself for the sudden temperature drop and reached for the door, it wouldn't open. The latch seemed frozen in place and wouldn't budge even a millimeter. Efforts didn't help. Dmitri tugged at the handle, hoping something would jam back in, but nothing did. Then he returned to the latch again. No effect. It was as if someone was standing on the other side, holding the latch. This thought immediately lowered the temperature in the bathroom by several degrees. Dmitri held his breath and strained his ears. Silence. Of course, there was no one outside. Dmitri always locked the apartment. Besides, he would have heard if anyone tried to get in. So it was just him and the door. An inanimate object indifferently blocking his way to the exit. Then Dmitri was slightly struck by claustrophobia, something he thought he never had.
Then, Dmitri remembered his phone. A search for jammed deadbolt, what should I do, yielded an ad, along with instructions for using a screwdriver and various tips like jiggling the door back and forth. Dmitri tried them, but the door wouldn't budge. He was already debating between resorting to extreme force and calling his parents who had a spare key. Meanwhile, Dmitri continued to automatically jiggle the jammed deadbolt. Suddenly, it finally clicked, and the path to freedom was clear. Dmitri brought a coin from his room, inserted it into the crack, and twisted it back and forth a few times. Everything worked. Nothing was loose or jammed. This struck Dmitri as odd, but he decided to deal with the door after his exam, which was scheduled for 2 days later.
The exam, however, was a bit of a disaster. Dmitri overslept. He'd been cramming for exam papers until 3 in the morning, and before going to bed, he'd set 5 alarms on his phone and 1 on his watch. He woke up 30 minutes late and immediately realized he didn't have to go anywhere. He'd be late for the train anyway, and waiting for the next one would make the delay even more catastrophic. Dmitri was a very light sleeper and always woke up to his alarm, but not this time. The technology had definitely worked. He heard it through his sleep. He even remembered his sleepy thoughts. I'm dreaming this. If this were real, I'd wake up. I wonder how long until the real alarm goes off. But there was another memory too. Something lingering and tormenting, like a nightmare that had plagued his consciousness all night. And then in the morning, it slithered like a spider into the darkness of oblivion. Dmitri decided it was all the result of stress and fatigue.
Having failed his exam, Dmitri, as he'd promised himself, tackled the bathroom door. He disassembled and lubricated the door mechanism, then tried the latch again, but didn't notice any significant changes. The smoothness and ease of movement remained almost the same. Something told Dmitri that the latch wasn't the problem at all. A week and a half passed, and a new problem caught Dmitri off guard. He just returned from successfully retaking the exam, the very one he'd slept through last time. He was looking forward to a nap and watching the movie his friend had been recommending for 6 months. But he couldn't get into the apartment. The key made one turn in the lock and then stopped, as if it had hit an obstacle. Dmitri made several more unsuccessful attempts and mentally scolded himself for his paranoid habit of locking the door twice. After hesitating for a bit, he decided to call a locksmith. Having reached Dmitri, he described his problem. There was a few seconds of silence on the line, and then a deep male voice sighed and answered. There's no one here right now. Wait half an hour, then try again. If it doesn't open, call back. And what will change in half an hour? In practice, it can. We've been getting these calls all week, and in most cases, everything opens on its own within half an hour. Dmitri tried turning the key in the lock again, but to no avail. He walked away from the door and began looking out the window. Something strange has been happening lately, thought Dmitri. First with the doors, then with the alarm clocks. Now this bell too? Maybe the guy lied to me? Maybe their technician just overslept and the switchboard operator is covering for him? I overslept recently too, apparently. Just like the quantum mechanics teacher the day before yesterday. A third of the class was terribly late back then too. At today's retake, I was the only one sitting, even though there should have been at least 5 of us. Dmitri was pulled from these thoughts by a child's scream coming from the street. Screams were common in the courtyard, including ones that could initially be mistaken for distress calls. But this one was different. Dmitri immediately realized this was no false alarm. It could have been the scream of a child whose friend he just witnessed being hit by a car. Dmitri looked out the window, but the angle didn't allow him to see the part of the courtyard he needed. He then went downstairs and once outside immediately realized that the center of the action was the playground across from the neighboring building. People on and near the playground were huddled together, examining the ground in front of them at something Dmitri couldn't see behind them. The screaming stopped. The student quickly walked toward the group. A child lay in the middle of the playground. A girl of about 6, dressed in a pink jacket and dark gray pants. A woman and a teenage boy were leaning over her, sitting in the snow. About 10 more people were crowding around. Come on, call!" the woman called to the boy, desperation evident in her voice. The teenager held the phone in his trembling hands, jabbing at the screen. Dmitri somehow automatically avoided the crowd of onlookers and headed straight for the epicenter of the action. The bystanders noticed him and became agitated, but the 2 people sitting near the girl paid no attention to Dmitri at all. The girl lay on the ground, her eyes wide open. Dmitri thought they were unnaturally large, like a doll's. The child's face had taken on a strange gray hue. Her lips had turned blue, and narrow black lines had appeared across them. The girl was motionless and seemed not even breathing. Her facial muscles had slackened, giving her a limp, even serene expression. But her gaze seemed to scream, desperately trying to convey something to those around her. "What happened?" Dmitri asked. The woman turned to the stranger for a second, but then returned her attention to the child. The student retreated to the gathered onlookers and whispered the question. "We don't know ourselves," the elderly woman in the down jacket babbled. "The kids were just playing and then Katyusha got sick." "She was looking at the house." A schoolboy with a school bag joined in the conversation. "She was looking at one of those windows." He pointed at the windows of Dmitri's entrance. "And she saw something there." "She's having a seizure," the elderly man said sympathetically. "My sister's daughter had the same thing when she was little." "A nightmare," Dmitri muttered and walked toward the entrance. Halfway there, he stopped and looked out the window of his apartment. "Calm down," he told himself. "My door just jammed, that's all. It was an accident." But he didn't feel any calmer. Instead of going home, Dmitri went to a cafe where he spent about an hour. When he returned, the courtyard was already empty. Dmitri entered the building and went up to his floor. Approaching the door, he inserted the key into the lock, held his breath, turned it once, and then the key hit another snag. The student exhaled, so he wouldn't have to open the black box alone. He dialed the locksmith service again and reported that the door hadn't opened after an hour. The voice on the other end asked for his address and promised to send a technician within 45 minutes. 45 minutes passed, then another 15. Dmitri called the service again, and they promised to contact a technician and find out what was wrong. 20 minutes later,
They called back and said the technician hadn't responded yet, and the others were still waiting. Dmitri was about to call another company, but suddenly an idea struck him. He went downstairs, went outside, and dialed his intercom number on the door. A familiar melody rang out. Dmitri was skeptical during the first 3 rings. By the second, a renewed sense of unease had surfaced within him. As the melody reached its 3rd ring, the feeling that something was about to happen reached its peak. The intercom continued to ring outside and in the probably empty apartment. For some reason, Dmitri suddenly imagined that he wasn't really himself, but someone else entirely trying to reach him, Dmitri in the apartment. And the real Dmitri was there, inside, dead, strangled by a wire, his eyes gouged out, lying on the hallway floor. The longer he waited, the stronger this feeling grew. Of course, the ringing was useless. Dmitri returned to the entryway. Without much anticipation, he tried to open the door again, and this time, the key made the remaining turn without difficulty. Dmitri pressed his ear to the door and listened. There was no sound coming from inside. This was a good sign, but the student still became uneasy. The silence frightened him, although any sound would probably have frightened him even more. Gathering his strength, Dmitri opened the door. Was everything like this when I left, he wondered, examining the hallway and the arrangement of objects within. What nonsense, of course it was like this. He entered the apartment, took off his shoes, and examined the room, kitchen, bathroom, and toilet. He paused in front of the kitchen window overlooking the courtyard. The girl had been looking out of it when she had her attack. One way or another, Dmitri decided to announce that his problem had been solved.
We'll pass it on to a repairman when he gets here. Still haven't been able to get through? Not yet. I just called and they say the number doesn't exist or is dialed incorrectly. The operator sounded confused. Something strange is going on, right? You said a lot of people are calling with the same problem as me? Don't tell me. Since last month, we've been getting 30 calls a day, and the same thing. The door won't open from the outside, that's all. Our guys come and can't do anything. No tool can open those doors. But then half an hour passes on the first try, and everything works again. Incidentally, I've never had anyone in the apartment at that moment. But that's when the front door is acting up. And here, someone couldn't get into their kitchen. And he didn't even have a deadbolt there. There's nothing to jam. But she says I pull the handle, but the door is stuck.
It opened later, of course. The maintenance workers complained twice more that the elevators weren't working. They'd arrive, but the doors wouldn't open. It was impossible to tell, basically. What do you think that is? What's there to think about? I don't know. Nobody here knows. Some people even say it's not technical. They believe in mysticism. There's really no other explanation, but I won't believe it until I see it with my own eyes. After hanging up, Dmitri Googled "door jammed" and went to the news section. Several related articles immediately popped up with titles like "Muscovites face the consequences of unusually cold weather. Door locks freeze overnight." The articles themselves described dozens of cases and, as the title suggested, attributed everything to unusually low temperatures. Dmitri wasn't sure if cold weather could have such an impact on locks, but he remembered all the previous winters, which had been significantly colder than this one. He specifically searched for articles on the same topic from previous years, but found nothing. However, Dmitri said to himself, it's understandable why this problem hasn't been widely reported yet. Everyone says it occurs in the morning, supposedly due to low nighttime temperatures, which means it mostly affects those returning home from night shifts. There aren't many of those. Of course, doors inside the building also stick, and the elevators too, but that's apparently less common. Then he shuddered. A very bad feeling stabbed him. Dmitri rushed into the hallway, quickly put on his shoes, and went out into the building. He headed for the elevators and pressed the call button. 10 seconds later, the elevator arrived. Its door slid open with the familiar creak. Dmitri walked inside, chose the first floor, and then walked back out. Then he called the elevator again. Something was wrong with the very rumble with which the second elevator rose from the depths of the building. It drags itself along like a wounded animal, Dmitri thought for some reason, imagining a horse with its hind legs severed. The sound grew louder and finally ended with a beeping sound, signaling the elevator's arrival. The elevator arrived, but its doors didn't open. Dmitri waited a minute, then pressed the button again. Then he gently knocked on the doors. Nothing. 2 minutes later, the elevator departed. They were calling it to another floor. Soon, Dmitri heard someone curse and stomp down the stairs. The student called the elevator again. It arrived obediently, but again refused to open its doors. Then, suddenly, Dmitri had a vague idea. His apartment door had opened after he'd rung the intercom. Of course, these could have been two completely separate events. But what if the call had sped up the process? Dmitri called the city's elevator emergency service using a number he found online. He gave the address, said a friend of his was stuck in the elevator and apparently ill, and asked the dispatcher to speak with him. The operator promised to honor his request and call back in 5 minutes. Dmitri waited tensely. While over 5 minutes passed, and still no bell rang. Suddenly, the elevator doors clanged as they began to open. Dmitri flinched and involuntarily backed away toward the elevator's exit. At first, he didn't even understand what he was seeing, and then his head began to spin. Dmitri was standing right next to the entrance to the corridor that ran between the apartments, and so when the elevator doors opened, he could only see a small part of it. There was a man in the elevator. The student stared at the man's head lying on the floor and turned toward Dmitri. His face was contorted, his mouth open in a pained grin, his eyes rolled back, revealing white orbs. Thoughts swarmed in Dmitri's head like flies on a dead body. The man in the elevator was obviously unconscious. He must have really been ill, just as Dmitri had just lied to the emergency services worker. The stranger's head was turned face up, meaning he needed to be turned over to prevent him from choking on his own tongue. That's what they taught him in first aid classes. To do that, he needed to approach him, but something was wrong with him. Only his head and a small part of his neck were visible, located near the elevator exit. Not right at the door, but a little further back. For some reason, Dmitri's imagination refused to complete the rest of the human body. His intuition told him he was in a very strange, unnatural position. On the one hand, to fit like that, the stranger would have had to curl up, tucking his legs under himself or propping them up on the far wall of the elevator where the mirror hung. Could a seizure have caused him to bend like that? Perhaps so, but there was another problem. His neck. It was elongated, as if he were trying to peer out of the elevator. Dmitri also couldn't see his Adam's apple. His neck resembled a smooth, flesh-colored cylinder, like a pipe. The student took a cautious step forward, then another. Gradually, the picture of what was happening inside the elevator unfolded. First, he saw a little more of the stranger's neck, then a little more neck. Again, an extension of the neck. Dmitri pressed himself against the wall opposite the elevators and slowly moved along it, increasingly realizing that the complete picture would be much worse than the fragment. There was no person in the elevator, just a head and neck, as long as a giraffe's, and an arm, a normal whole human arm, bloodied and with broken fingers. Both arm and neck protruded from behind a mirror covered in bloodstains, and where they emerged from the lower right edge, the flesh was flattened to the thickness of a napkin, as if the person had been squashed into a pancake and tucked into the vanishingly narrow gap between the mirror and the wall, leaving only 2 parts of the body exposed. Dmitri lost consciousness. He came to slowly. He didn't remember what had happened or where he was now, but assumed he was at home. He only knew that in his sleep he had been tormented by a haunting, confusing nightmare. In it, Dmitri had either been in an accident or fallen from a roof, and then spent a long, painful time trying to figure out how badly he had been injured. He couldn't see anything in the dream, and blindly felt his body searching for wounds and fractures. As luck would have it, these attempts did not yield a concrete answer. Here, it seemed, was a thigh,
and underneath it was a knee, but it immediately turned into a shoulder, from which began an arm, somehow bent and twisted. So much so that the little finger could be found, but the index finger was impossible to find. Dmitri groaned and shifted. The floor beneath him was hard, meaning he really had gotten into some kind of trouble, perhaps even injured himself. This thought unsettled him. He opened his eyes abruptly and stared at the gray ceiling with its remnants of whitewash. This was completely abnormal. Dmitri felt a cold fear, far more real than his delirious visions, began to return to him. He turned his head to the side and met the dead man's gaze. The man was still grinning in pain and staring at Dmitri with blind white eyes. His 5-foot-long neck, broken in the middle and pinned by the fragile mirror like a sheet of metal, slid down the wall and trailed across the floor. Suddenly, Dmitri felt as if it would rise up and lunge at him like a cobra. Dmitri sat up abruptly and, emitting hoarse, pitiful cries, crawled toward the elevator exit. He stopped a couple of times and tried to stand, but his legs barely obeyed him, and he could only push slightly. He reached the corridor, and the terrifying scene disappeared from his field of vision, but the panic did not subside. He felt as if a person's head would appear from around the corner at any moment. He even fancied he heard sounds coming from the direction of the elevator. Then, very close by, a loud metallic noise was heard. Dmitri yelped in surprise, but a moment later realized it was one of his neighbors emerging into the stairwell. Dmitri only managed to crawl into the elderly woman's apartment, screaming hysterically and incoherently, and slammed the door behind him. The neighbor groaned, began wailing, and ran into the kitchen. Dmitri sat on the shoe mat, completely alone, for several minutes before he began to come to his senses. The police arrived 15 minutes later. All this time, Dmitri remained by the door, listening intently to what was happening beyond. Almost nothing disturbed the silence. The elevator never closed or moved. Dmitri heard the police approaching and immediately opened the door. When called, he said that a man had been murdered in the elevator. In many ways, this seemed to be true. There were 3 police officers. They briefly questioned the young man and inquired about the location of the deceased. Dmitri pointed toward the elevators. The officers retreated into the elevator bay, and Dmitri heard expletives. Among other things, one of the officers uttered a strange remark. What? Is he fencing himself off or something? As far as could be determined, this was referring to the deceased. Dmitri left his neighbor's apartment, but didn't go back to his own. Instead, he went downstairs and began eavesdropping on the police. They seemed surprised because they'd never seen anything like it before, but they had some reason to believe that what had happened wasn't at all unlikely. "I fucking told you this wouldn't end well," one ranted. "Who the hell knows what happened here?" another replied. "So every time it closes off, there could be this kind of crap in there?" a third asked, lowering his voice. "Nobody's ever gotten stuck inside before. No luck here. Okay, we'll wait until the 19th and see." 10 minutes later, an ambulance arrived. Behind them came more police and some plainclothes men. There were about 10 people in total. Everyone who arrived was walking up the stairs, and Dmitri, of course, was noticed. 2 police officers invited him to come with them to the station. At the station, Dmitri described the past day in detail. After telling about the elevator, he returned and told about the problems with the door and the child's seizure in the courtyard.
When Dmitri had finished his rant and the flow of questions had dried up, he took the initiative. What do we do now? Now? Go home. There are no more questions for now. They'll call you if they need anything. No, I mean, what about the door and all that? It's happened to me twice already, and I've heard of other cases. What if the door jams again? I'm afraid that's not our area of expertise. Well, it's definitely connected to that man from the elevator, and you know that too. Are you saying you and your apartment are connected to a man's death? The policeman frowned. Connected in some other way besides what you've already told me?
"Just don't scare me, please," Dmitri pleaded compassionately. "I'm scared enough, as you can see.
I've told you everything I know. It's just that there are clearly a lot of similarities here. An isolated space that suddenly locks itself and something terrible happens inside. I just want to understand if I can go back to my apartment. To my apartment, of course. It's safe there. Why are you hesitating? Because the man died in the elevator. So no one knows what happened to him. There will be an investigation. If information comes out, they'll write about it in the news. You'll read about it. Wait. The second policeman, who had been almost silent then, suddenly joined the conversation. Just wait and don't try to look inside. Not through the window, not through the camera. That's the most important thing. When it opens, you can come in.
What about the elevators? What about other spaces? Are they more dangerous there than in your apartment? Exactly the same. I mean, almost none. What you saw today was one of a tiny percentage of cases. Live as usual, and the only advice you've already received.
Dimitri was driving home, desperately searching the internet. Over the past few hours, there had been numerous search queries and forum questions on the topic, such as, why are all the locks malfunctioning? Is it mystical or what? I can't get into the kitchen. The bathroom door has broken for the 5th time this week, and so on.
But none of these posts prompted a broad discussion, or most importantly, any realistic explanations or attempts to understand the situation as a whole. Typically, the authors were met with responses from equally clueless, though sometimes knowledgeable about locks and doors, jokers, or those who veered the conversation into the realm of pure esotericism.
A dozen articles were also found that copied the abnormal cold theory Dimitri had already read. Another amusing discussion surfaced on the website of a door lock manufacturer, which was inundated with dozens of complaints. For some reason, these particular locks were the most common problem. The company representative, with a straight face, assured customers that they had forgotten how to use their keys.
Dimitri began analyzing the queries and found a pattern. Those that were more than a month old, there weren't many of those, 10 topics, weren't about apartment doors, but about self-locking cabinets, drawers, car trunks, and mezzanines.
Dimitri even came across a video of the author wearing dark glasses and a surgical mask, attacking his own closet from various angles with an axe and a drill in the middle of a cluttered room. Splinters flew in all directions, but the wood remained unyielding. In fact, there weren't even any visible marks left.
Having completed his assault, the video's subject began tugging at the door handle, bracing his foot against the cabinet and hanging on with his entire body, but nothing worked. Finally, he held the camera up to the cabinet and with loud snorting spent 2 minutes filming the boards, which showed not a single scratch. In the comments, he vigorously debated skeptics, proving that the cabinet had temporarily become an anomaly. Having finished his internet search, Dimitri turned to his contacts. First, he contacted his mother and was relieved to learn that his parents hadn't encountered anything unusual, even though the neighbor's front door had broken down twice in a week. Dimitri briefly recounted the latest events to his mother, excluding the incident with the body in the elevator, and asked her to keep her phone handy at all times and to tell his father the same. He also asked that, if possible, they be in the apartment or leave it at the same time. Judging by his mother's voice, she didn't quite believe Dimitri, but she agreed nonetheless.
One, two. I see you. 3, 4. At your door. 5, 6. Don't turn your head. 7, 8. It's getting late.